let's be honest about one thing. There's one person without whom this would not exist, and he's no longer with us. Our hearts have been reeling over the past week since we learned of the passing of Donald Smith, and it's important that our community take a few minutes now to celebrate this man, this incredible force for good in the world, and to those ends, I'd like you to welcome to the stage my colleague, Dr. Tom G. Palmer.
Ladies and gentlemen, my responsibility tonight is to celebrate the achievements of an important person who is our host this evening. We are all here as guests of the Smith Family Foundation, but the host who made it possible is not seated among us tonight. Donald G. Smith, a personal friend to so many of us here, and a true friend of the principles we all share: liberty, justice, peace, and dignity, wanted to be here with us as he hosted and took part in these freedom dinners for more than a decade. But on the evening of Wednesday, October 30, he drew his last breath. Our mutual friend, Scott Barbie, mentioned to me last week some of the ways in which Don's life exemplifies the virtues of the Stoics. And I've since spent some time rereading Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and Don's life shines through. One thought from Marcus's Meditations summed up Don Smith's virtue. Marcus wrote to himself, "Don't live as though you were going to live a myriad lives. Fate is hanging over your head. While you have life, become good." It's difficult to use the past tense in referring to our friend. It really catches in the throat to say he was a good man, so I won't use the past tense, because this is an occasion to celebrate the goodness and the kindness and the generosity and the integrity of a friend. And those virtues continue to be active in the world through the many projects he launched and the many people he helped. His mind continues to be active in the millions of people who were introduced to the ideas of freedom because of his vision. His goodness lives on through the millions and millions of lives he saved from tyranny and even from death. Our friend is a modest and unpretentious person, so he would be blushing and pshawing if he were to hear what I will say tonight, but it is all true. Very few of his beneficiaries will ever know to whom they should be grateful for the generosity that defended their liberty, or, in at least two notable cases, forestalled civil wars that would have killed many thousands of people. But we who know have a duty to acknowledge publicly the positive impact this one human being, Donald Smith, has had on the world, which is a much better place because of him. His life continues to enrich those who know him, his family, his colleagues, his friends, and also the many more who never had that privilege. Don earned degrees in business and accounting, an MBA, and a law degree, worked for a number of investment firms before forming his own, Donald Smith and Company. His knowledge of accounting, finance, and business informs his approach to cost-cutting. Investing capital in overlooked and underappreciated enterprises adds value to the world, a philosophy that also guides the Smith Family Foundation's philanthropy. Donald Smith seeks to achieve his ends at the lowest cost so that resources can be freed up to add yet more value to the world. One can simultaneously strive for excellence and quality and seek to do so economically. Unlike the portrayal in almost all popular media, cost cutters are not bad people. Don and his team understand that cutting costs frees up resources to satisfy yet more human needs. It informs his investing and his own life. As the director of the Cato Institute, Don would take neither a private jet, nor a commercial air flight, nor the Acela train, but the Chinatown bus from Manhattan to Washington, D.C. When we flew together to visit our mutual friend George M. Yeager, both of us flew discounted coach economy tickets. I had an aisle seat, and Don was seated between a couple, both of whom were very large people who had clearly hoped that the seat between them would remain empty. And I quietly offered Don to trade places, and he declined. And I asked him later, I said, why didn't you fly business class, as you could afford that? And I got a lesson in his philosophy. He said, I save my money so I can spend it on the things that are important to me. Free markets, liberty, that stuff. Don attended a Cato University seminar I was running some years ago, and he met Robin Sitawala of the Samriddhi Prosperity Foundation of Nepal. And Robin pitched Don and convinced him to invest in their work, which, as it turned out, saved millions of people from a nightmare. The Samriddhi team effectively neutralized, through very active public education campaigns, the appeal and the destructive proposals of Nepal's extreme communist movements, which had acquired the reins of government. The Samriddhi team had the courage and the determination, and Donald Smith and his colleagues provided the capital. And I shudder to think what would have happened without that partnership. The Smith Family Foundation also supported the libertarians in Kyrgyzstan, whose initiative and courage prevented a civil war that the Kremlin was stirring up between ethnic groups. The Central Asian Free Market Institute mobilized volunteers to distribute food to villages that had been attacked, used cell phone networks and GPS to guide people around ambushes, and campaigned on the radio for peace in every language spoken in the region, urging people not to fall for these deliberate, coordinated acts of provocation. And the civil war that could have taken 100,000 or more lives did not happen. And Donald Smith made that not happening possible. Don and his team members suggested that I vet and nominate opportunities for the foundation to invest in places where modest investments could have a very high return on investment. And I spend a lot of my time in very poor places with truly terrible governance. That's why they're poor. And so I know about places with potential for freeing creative energy and the brave people who are willing to advance the good ideas and policies in difficult places. And millions of people have experienced measurable increases in their freedom and their well-being because of those investments that are vetted, administered, monitored, measured, and documented by my colleagues at Atlas Network, but made possible by the Smith Family Foundation. In 2012, I sent a letter to our partners, all those who had benefited from these investments. I wrote not to chide them, as they're already very good cost-conscious activists, but to remind them of our duty. Dear colleagues, I'm writing about something that may seem obvious, but of which we must remind ourselves constantly. Our donors make sacrifices to make our work possible. We should never think of our support as falling from the skies or as just being there for us. It is earned by people who make conscious decisions to part with it in order to support our work. One of our donors, Donald Smith, is a very successful businessman who lives and works in New York City. When he leaves events that he has paid for, other people wave for taxis, but Don walks across the street to take the bus. He just flew from New York to Tokyo and back on business, and he flew both ways, discounted coach airfare. When he travels to Washington, D.C., he takes the bus and saves $100 each way rather than taking the train. The bus has Wi-Fi, too, and he takes his computer and works on the trip. Then he writes substantial checks to support causes that are important to him, including our projects. He told me that he saves money so that he can spend it on what really matters to him. Then in the letter, I detailed ways to cut costs, recycling and repairing equipment, competitive bidding, and so on, and concluded, if you see a way to accomplish our ends less expensively, act on it. Cutting costs means adding value to the world. And that was my attempt to distill and share some of Donald Smith's wisdom. Our friend has continued a very long tradition in the liberty movement, a tradition of value creators who quietly and modestly create shared value by advancing libertarian principles and policies. And two great figures in the libertarian tradition come to my mind when I think of Don and his impact. The Brazilian abolitionist Joaquim Nabuco lived from 1849 to 1910, and he worked tirelessly for the liberation of the enslaved people of his country. And Nabucco exhorted us to educate your children, educate yourselves in the love for the freedom of others. For only in this way will your own freedom not be a gratuitous gift from fate. You'll be aware of its worth and will have the courage to defend it. On Friday in Sao Paulo, I gave a keynote address to over 1,050 members of the Brazilian Students for Liberty at their big national conference. I talked about Nabucco's example and the example of their host, Donald Smith, for the event that brought students from all over Brazil, was partly funded by an investment from the Smith Family Foundation through a grant through Atlas Network. The huge audience of young Brazilians who are excited by the ideas of Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises, and F.A. Hayek, Frederic Bastiat, and Joaquim Nabucco understood that Donald Smith loved their freedom. And many came up after to ask that I convey to the Smith family and to all of Don's friends their appreciation and love. Indeed, it was an investment of $17,500 in 2009 from the Smith Family Foundation in a Liberty Strategy Conference in Porto Alegre and the Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul that reinvigorated the freedom movement in Brazil and resulted in so much change, including many of our young friends being elected to state legislatures and the federal government. Muito obrigado, Donald. Thank you so much for your farsightedness. Donald Smith's love for the freedoms of others continues to burn brightly across the world. He has inspired thousands and thousands and thousands of young people on every continent. He's continuing the legacy of another great figure, Jacques-Claude Marie Vincent de Gournay, who lived from 1712 to 1759. He popularized the phrase, laissez-faire, laissez-passer, le monde va de lui-même, roughly, leave us alone, butt out, let us do what we're going to do. The world runs itself. He also invented a word we all use, bureaucracy, meaning government from the desk. De Gournay was a businessman and an investor, and he devoted his resources to advancing the ideas and the policies of liberty. He arranged translation and publication of books about libre-échange, or free exchange, and he also took under his wing young people whom he instructed in the principles of liberty. Very notable among them, the young Henri Robert Jacques Turgot, who later became Minister of Finance, and in that role abolished barriers to trade, replaced the forced labor system known as the corvée with voluntary paid labor, introduced cost-cutting measures in government, reduced public expenditures and debt, and eliminated prosperity-destroying mercantilistic interventions and monopolies. Turgot later advised the Americans in their revolution to, quote, reduce to the smallest number the kinds of affairs of which the government of each state should take charge. After his teacher, de Gournay, had passed away, he wrote an elegy, and he said that his mentor was, quote, developing those principles which experience in business had taught him. Vincent de Gournay was the Donald Smith of his day. Both Vincent de Gournay and Donald Smith saw value where others did not only in business opportunities, but in the rule of law, the presumption of liberty, and those are the foundations for prosperity. Vincent de Gournay and Donald Smith invested in the liberty movement, and those investments continue to improve the world. Their modesty led them to invest not in monuments to vanity, but in the freedom of their fellow human beings. Christopher Wren was the architect who rebuilt London after the Great Fire of 1666, including 52 magnificent churches. His body is interred in his masterpiece, St. Paul's Cathedral, beneath a humble stone that is inscribed, if you seek his monument, look around you. My friends, if you seek Donald Smith's monument, look around you. This is a celebration of a life well lived. So I conclude with a phrase that I heard many times from Donald Smith after a thorough grilling on whether we were investing his money wisely. And I still hear his voice. He'd say, now, go get him. Thank you, Don. Let's go get him.
come. Thank